following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philly, how you's doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. 2019 was supposed to be the Phillies' breakout year, the first time in 8 seasons that the Fightins would make the playoffs. At the beginning of the season, it appeared as if the Phillies had solved their offensive woes of 2018 with the acquisitions of Bryce Harper, Andrew McCutchen, JT Realmuto, Gene Segura, and Jay Bruce. The pitching was suspect, but it was anticipated that Aaron Nola would anchor the starting rotation, with former Cy Young Award winner Jake Arrieta being a solid number 2. Then there were Zach Eflin, Vince Velasquez, Jared Eichhoff, and Nick Pivetta. If just one of those 4 youngsters improved on their performance of the previous season, the Phillies, it was believed, would be fine, especially with the bullpen of David Robertson, Hector Neris, Sir Anthony Dominguez, and Tommy Hunter. But the best laid plans came apart in late May when the Phillies were 10 games over 500 and 3.5 games up in the NL East. They proceeded to drop 16 of their next 22 games, including a 7-game losing streak, which landed them in second place, 5 games behind the Eastern Division leading Atlanta Braves. They never got back on track, finishing in 4th place. In today's podcast, we will break down the Phillies' disappointing 2019 season with Todd Zolecki, Phillies beat writer for MLB.com, and author of a forthcoming biography on Roy Halladay. Welcome to the podcast, Todd.
Thanks. How are you doing?
Well, I'd be doing a lot better if the Phillies had a new manager right now, but we'll get to that. I'd imagine it's been a pretty rough season covering this team.
Yeah, it has been. I think certainly, like anybody that is a fan, as a reporter, I kind of anticipated the same things. I thought that this team would make the playoffs, or at least be a little bit more competitive than they ended up being. They finished 81-81, the first non-losing record since 2012, when they also finished 500. But based on all the talent that they brought in, you certainly would have thought that they would have been a lot better than that. And that's why I think right now there's a kind of a lot of dissatisfied fans, a lot of angry fans out there, a lot of frustrated fans out there, wondering kind of what went wrong and how are they going to fix it, and is this team going to make the playoffs anytime soon?
If I had to identify 3 reasons for the Phillies season, the disappointing season, it'd have to be first, poor pitching, both starting and relief. Second, a lack of urgency and accountability among the players and the manager. And third, the failure to play situational baseball when they needed to score runs. There's nothing wrong with analytics, but the best teams who all embrace analytics, people like the Braves, the Cardinals, the Dodgers, they play situational baseball when they need to. Todd, what in your estimation were the 2 or 3 biggest reasons the Phillies failed to make the postseason?
Yeah, you mentioned the pitching, and I think that probably for me is number 1 as well. I never quite understood going into the season how they thought that this was going to be a top 10 rotation. Aaron Nola had a great year last year, certainly. Jake Arrieta, he was okay. He struggled down the stretch. And then you mentioned earlier Zach Eflin, Vince Velasquez, and Nick Pivetta. They really thought that those 3 guys, based on some of their metrics that they place a lot of value on, were going to take a step forward. If not all of them, then maybe 2 of them. If not 2 of them, then certainly 1 of them, based on the numbers that they put up last season, based on the fact that they were going to have a better defense. And they basically just totally misevaluated that. The depth of their starting pitching and the effectiveness of their starting pitching, that kind of put them behind the 8 ball a little bit. And then they lost 7 key relievers. I mean, it's a very real thing to lose. You go into the season thinking that David Robertson, Tommy Hunter, Pat Neshek, Sir Anthony Dominguez, Victor Arano, Adam Morgan are all going to be big pieces of your bullpen, and most of those guys barely pitched this season. So you combined the kind of misevaluation of the rotation and the injuries to the bullpen, and it was very tough for these guys to compete, I guess, as they thought that they would compete. I also think a thing that kind of hurt them was the decision in July to not really be super aggressive in terms of the trade deadline and getting reinforcements. I think they looked at they looked at this team and they said, hey, if we're being honest about it, we're probably not good enough to win a World Series, so we're not going to give up any prospects at all, to find an arm or two or to find a bench bat perhaps that could help along the way. They did make moves. You mentioned Jay Bruce. They got Corey Dickerson. Everybody else, so they kind of picked off the scrap heap. Mike Moran, Blake Parker, Jared Hughes. And they could have I also would I would not have traded Alec Bohm, their top position player prospect. I would not have traded Spencer Howard, the top pitching prospect, for anybody really this season, because I also didn't think that the Phillies were good enough to win the World Series. But I also think you could probably find a balance there between, just picking up some guys off of waivers and, doing what the Phillies did in 2009, 10, and 11, which was, trade a bunch of prospects to get Cliff Lee, Roy Oswalt, and Hunter Pence. And the Phillies decided to go the opposite direction there, and that was just pretty much stand pat. And hey, if they had been a little bit more aggressive, could have gotten them in the playoffs? Maybe, maybe not. But I always believe that, you got to at least try a little bit, because you don't know when these opportunities are going to come around again. Like if next year you lose Aaron Nola to an injury or Bryce Harper to an injury, and now you're sitting there going, oh, okay, well maybe when 2021 rolls around and we're healthy, we'll make a run then. So I always think you got to take advantage of those opportunities. So, so I think the pitching disappointment, I think the relative conservative nature of the front office at July 31st, and I just think, and I do think that lack of urgency in the clubhouse, if there was a little bit more of that, maybe things pick up a little bit. To me, I think it says a lot that this team has really played bad baseball the last two Septembers. They've got the fifth worst record in baseball over the last two Septembers, and I think that's a concerning trend as they go forward.
Well, the irony about the way they played is they played below 500 against losing teams, including the last place Marlins and Pirates. However, they've played 500 or above against winning teams. Now, to me, there's something wrong there. If they were just bad or mediocre or incompetent, they wouldn't be playing that kind of baseball against winning teams. So to me, that goes back to the manager. And the manager, if his team is that inconsistent, has got to be a better motivator of the players. And those stats, those stats are really telling. The other thing that you mentioned was standing pat at the trade deadline. And what I never understood was why Matt Klentak did not improve the pitching in the offseason, particularly to get Keuchel when he had him, when he would have paid chump change, $13 million for a one-year deal with Keuchel. That was more than affordable. And if he was going to go with that starting rotation that he had from last year, which was very risky, why on earth did they let what's his name, their pitching coach, Kranitz? Why did they let Kranitz go? Because whatever success that young pitching staff had in 2018 was due to Kranitz. And he just proved his worth in Atlanta this year, bringing along another young starting rotation. And you signed Chris Young simply because other clubs are interested. He might leave. Well, let him leave. Let him go.
Right.
I mean, you don't just cut the pitchers off at the legs when they're delivering with a guy like Kranitz. And then the last thing is, in defense of Gabe Kapler, Klentak cut him off at the knees. He didn't give him the pitching he needed, and he didn't get the help he needed at the deadline. So I blame this just as much on Matt Klentak as I do on Gabe Kapler.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of heat on both people right now, and the Rick Kranitz thing to me I thought was a big deal. Rick Kranitz, old school baseball guy, not really analytically inclined, but he's a good coach, and I think people kind of underestimate this or brush it aside, but a big part of coaching is developing relationships and building trust, and Rick Kranitz was tremendous at that, and he built that trust and built those relationships with Aaron Nola and Zach Eflin and Vince Velasquez and Nick Pivetta and all the other pitchers on staff. And because he might not have necessarily agreed with some of the analytics that were being taught, they basically just booted him and replaced him with Chris Young, the assistant pitching coach, who's never coached before. He had a scouting background, and it just flat out did not work. It just did not work. And you mentioned what Rick Kranitz has done with the Braves. Mike Soroka, Max Fried have all pitched well. Julio Teheran is having his best year in a few years. So is it all because of Rick Kranitz? I can't say that, but I do think that there is something to be said for having a good coach. And I just think that they kind of whiffed there, and I think that is something that they have to kind of figure out going forward. Is it's okay to have different opinions. Everything old is not bad, and I think that is certainly the case with Rick Kranitz. I think they should have kept him, and it'll be interesting to see what they do. I would be stunned if Chris Young returns as pitching coach. But then if they do replace him, who do they get? I hope that they go out and find a coach to be the pitching coach. And then you can find an analytics guy to be the assistant pitching coach who can kind of crunch all those numbers, those tendencies, those heat maps, and then have the pitching coach kind of disseminate that information as how he wants to do it.
And that is the tandem they had in 2018, and it worked as best it could. So I don't know why Klentak messed with it, unless Gabe Kapler was intimidated by having that kind of experience in Kranitz. The analytics is a whole other issue. In spring training, Andy McPhail was asked about the improvement he saw within the organization over the 4 years since he was hired as team president. And McPhail cited what he called the hiring of new ground personnel, including mental skills coaches, a robust analytics department, and these are his words, and player information coordinators at both the big league and minor league levels. These, he said, quote, are common to other MLB teams but new to the Phillies, end of quote. Yeah, that's true. The Phillies tend to move to extremes. They were the last to adopt analytics, but now that they've adopted them, they're going to an extreme. There is this nagging feeling among the fans and some of the writers that there is an over-reliance on analytics within the organization at the expense of situational baseball and traditional evaluative methods. What do you think, Todd?
Yeah, I think so. I think there can be a better balance there. Look at, Gabe Kapler basically acknowledged it in June. At one point in June, he said, we are going to simplify our approach at the plate, and he didn't really expound on that, so I followed up with him. This was in his office before a game one day, and I said, well, what do you mean it was getting too complex? What was too complex about what you guys were doing? And he was basically saying how, we were telling hitters to go up there looking for specific pitches in certain counts. So everything that I've ever heard from great hitters over the years is you kind of sit on the fastball and attack the fastball, and you adjust to everything else. And that's because the fastball is the easiest pitch to hit. And if you're getting someone throws you a on-point, sharp slider, breaking ball, whatever, you're probably not going to hit that pitch anyway. But if somebody throws you their slider and it hangs or it backs up on you or it's a cutter, same thing, whatever, you can adjust and you can smack that. But if you're not looking fastball, it can come back to haunt you. And so essentially what they were doing is saying, okay, in a 2-0 count here, this guy likes to throw this particular pitch in this particular part of the strike zone, so be looking here. So now if the guy, doesn't throw that pitch, you're not ready for the fastball, you might let a fastball go down the middle of the plate. And this is something that Gabe Kapler acknowledged, that the offensive approach was too complicated. And he said essentially the same thing with the pitching. I followed up the next day, said, what about the pitching? He said, yeah, same thing. We need to simplify that approach a little bit. And so those things are real. I had a good conversation the other day with Jake Arrieta. Everybody knows that the Phillies have tried to push a lot of their pitchers that have good spin rates on fastballs to throw more four-seam fastballs at the top of the strike zone. And if you look at the numbers, it's hard to argue against it, because if they can throw a good four-seam fastball at the top of the zone, they do have a lot of success with it. So you look at that, statistically speaking, and you say, okay, yeah, if the hitters are only hitting 130 against it, yeah, have them start throwing more four-seam fastballs at the top of the zone. But the problem is if you can't locate that pitch on a consistent basis, it's going to start to get crushed. And what Jake Arrieta said is, if you can elevate your fastball at the top of the zone, great. But if the problem is that if you throw it 2 balls down, meaning the length of 2 balls down in the zone, now everybody's been looking up at this guy all day. So now that pitch looks, wow, that's right down the heart of the plate. Boom, home run. Guy's knocked out of the game in a few innings. So, and I think that was something that maybe Rick Kranitz didn't necessarily subscribe to, so he tried to have pitchers maybe pitch to their strengths a little bit more, or maybe not do what they wanted the pitchers to do as much. You saw Zach Eflin basically tell Chris Young this late in the season when he returned to the rotation. He's like, listen, I can't keep throwing four-seam fastballs anymore. It's not me. I'm a sinker ball guy. I want to throw strikes in the bottom of the zone and have them put the ball in play. I want them to get ground outs. And they said, okay, and he came back the second half of the season, and he actually pitched with some pretty good success. In fact, I think he pitched well enough that, not knowing what else the Phillies are going to do in the offseason, that at the very least he's going to be your number 5 starter next year. Now, Vince Velasquez and Nick Pivetta I don't know about, but I would actually be pretty okay with if Zach Eflin is your number 4 or number 5 guy going forward, based on the effectiveness that he showed at the beginning of the season and at the very end of the season.
We talk about, and fans have been talking about, Klentak and Kapler, but I don't think Andy MacPhail should escape scrutiny either. When he was hired as a team president 4 years ago, he said, and I quote, "The goal as a franchise is to have the quickest turnaround from a rebuild under a new regime to the postseason." And he identified that as 4 years. When he met with reporters on July 12th of this season, he was singing a different tune. At that time, the Phillies held the National League's final playoff spot by a half game over the Brewers, and he told the media, quote, that if the season ended today, we would have had our goal. We would be in the postseason in our 4th year. If we don't, we don't, end of quote. Now, that kind of complacency does not play well among the fans, and I'm sure owner John Middleton didn't appreciate that answer either, after doling out more than $350 million in free agent salaries during the offseason. Nor is that attitude limited to MacPhail. Throughout the season, general manager Matt Klentak and manager Gabe Kapler never demonstrated a sense of urgency, always being satisfied, even happy about the mediocre performance of his team. Do you think any of these guys understand the sports culture in this city?
Yeah, that's a fair question to ask, and I do think that they have said some things that I would love to know behind the scenes in private if they regret saying that. I mean, if we don't, we don't. It honestly could be kind of in the last calendar year regarding the Phillies, the quote of the year. And I say that people remember John Middleton's stupid money quote at the owners' meeting at the beginning of last off season. You could not go anywhere. You could not go a day last off season without somebody saying, the Phillies are going to spend stupid money. But in Philadelphia, the "if we don't, we don't" quote, I think overtook that as the quote of the year for the Phillies. And yeah, I do think that sometimes, none of these guys are from Philly. not that you have to be from Philly to work for the Phillies. It doesn't work that way. But I do think that they have stumbled in terms of acknowledging or recognizing what makes this city tick. I do think, I shouldn't say I do think, I know for a fact that the front office was floored at the response that fans had in February and March after Bryce Harper signed with the Phillies. They were told that if you sign him, people are going to go crazy, and I think they just didn't believe. They're like, yeah, okay, we'll get a little bit of a bump. We'll get a little bit of a Bryce Harper bump. And then when he signed and they sold hundreds of thousands of tickets in the first month or first few days, I can't remember what the numbers were. I wrote about it a lot. I don't remember the numbers. They were huge, though. And I think they were genuinely surprised that the reaction was like that. And to me, that just shows that, you might need to get to know the city a little bit better, get to know the people a little bit more, and also embrace it too. Like, fans that get upset or care, it's better than the alternative. It's better than being the GM or the team president in Tampa Bay or Arizona or San Diego, where, you're just struggling to get anybody to care about the team. Here there's a lot of people that care about the team, and I think Jason Wirth said it best in March as he kind of talked to people about, Bryce Harper coming to Philly and how is he going to handle fans? What's he going to do when he gets booed? And it's only a matter of time before he gets booed. And Jason Wirth basically said, I told Bryce, Philadelphia is the best city in the world to win in. It's probably the worst city in the world to lose in, but it's the best city in the world to live in. And he looked at that as a good thing. And I think sometimes, the front office, they don't understand the fan base. They don't understand the passion. They don't understand, like, why are they so mad that, we didn't go out and make some big moves in July. Why don't they understand what's kind of going on here? It's because they want to win and they haven't won in a while. And again, it's not the worst thing in the world to have a fan base that cares a lot.
If the Phillies fire Gabe Kapler, which I think is very warranted after two very frustrating seasons when we were in first and then had prolonged slumps and lost it. If they do fire Gabe Kapler, there are several candidates out there. I don't know how realistic they are. Joe Madden probably is going to end up with the Anaheim Angels, Girardi with the Cubs. Buck Showalter's name has been thrown about, although he's hardly an analytics guy, and I think his time might have passed. I don't know about Clint Hurdle either. I think that's more of the same. I personally would love to see a tandem, an interim tandem of Charlie Manuel and Larry Bowa. Manuel is the manager, Bowa is the bench coach. I know that won't happen, but I think as Paul Owens did twice in his career, to go down into the trenches and find out what they have in that organization is very warranted. And Manuel and Bowa can do that, and then the next year you hire somebody. But if the Phillies are so undecided even about firing Kapler, which it seems they are, I mean, after, 2 days the season's over and they still haven't made a move, that might be their best bet, because whatever else is out there might not be around next week. What are your feelings on the manager situation, Todd?
Yeah, it's interesting that this is kind of dragged on, and it might drag on a few more days. I think, that could tell you two things. One is they just don't know. One is that they're still talking to people, trying to figure out what the feeling is in the clubhouse. Bryce Harper said after the season finale on Sunday, saying, "Hey, I'm definitely willing to talk about this team going forward. I'm around for the next 12 years. I would like to be involved." So I have no doubt that John Middleton has reached out to Bryce Harper, and if he hasn't already, plans to talk to Bryce, as well as probably some other players, and just try to get a feel for, what they think of Gabe Kapler. Now, in terms of Charlie and Bowa, I personally would love to see that happen. I love Charlie and I love Bowa. They're both awesome baseball guys. But I think Charlie is 75, and I think from a personal level, he's just not interested in managing. It's a lot of travel. It's a lot of crazy hours, and so for that reason, I don't think that he would be interested. But I do think that they need to. They obviously need to make a decision either way. If they do decide to move on from Gabe Kapler, they do have some options out there. People mention Buck Showalter a lot because he was in Baltimore for years, so he knows Andy McPhail, Matt Klentak, and Ned Rice, the assistant GM. Mike Scioscia is a name out there that I think is interesting. Now, he's not an analytics guy either, so do they go for a guy with a pedigree that might not be as big in analytics? That would definitely be interesting because the Phillies have invested so much money into making this stuff work. Or do they maybe go for, I don't want to say, I'm not saying Kapler 2.0, but what I'm saying is somebody younger with less experience. I mentioned a guy the other day in one of my stories. Raul Ibanez works in the Dodgers front office. Raul is incredibly bright, incredibly well respected. He works with the Dodgers. I think he understands how analytics works. And coming from the Dodgers, although Gabe Kapler did come from the Dodgers, but coming from the Dodgers, I think he knows how they implement this stuff to players. And so he might have a different perspective on how the Phillies do it versus how the Dodgers do it, because I'm sure some things have changed even in the past couple of years since Gabe worked for the Dodgers as their farm director. But a big decision coming up. If they keep him, it puts pressure on everybody. If they move on, it buys the front office a little bit more time. But hey, Matt Klentak seems to really want Gabe to come back, and I guess I give him credit in that regard because he's kind of putting his neck out on the line for what he believes. So, in a sense, I give him a lot of credit because I think he knows that if Gabe does come back, the heat turns up on him, but he seems to be willing to accept that. So again, because I thought a couple days ago for sure that Gabe was going to be replaced, but as this drags on and on, I'm kind of not so sure anymore.
Well, there's also a feeling out there that the problems run deeper than just the parent club, too. I mean, there are concerns about the amateur scouting and the coaching staff. In September, Johnny Amares resigned as scouting director, and during his 5 seasons in that position, Scott Kingery appears to be the only draft pick of value. The others, Cole Irvin, Mickey Moniak, and Cornelius Randolph, haven't amounted to much. And I think that was reinforced when the Phillies needed call-ups after injuries during the season. And there was nothing there. Especially among the pitching. So there's a problem with the amateur scouting if that's the case. And the farm system isn't as good as everybody says, at least it was. And then in terms of the coaching staff, last year you had several minor league coaches who were dismissed. Last September it was hitting coordinator Andy Tracy, his assistant Frank Cacciatore, Sal Rende, the hitting coach at AAA Lehigh Valley, and John Miserak, the hitting coach at High A Clearwater. This year it was the pitching coaches, including Schrenk at Lehigh Valley. What are the Phillies doing here? I mean, the scouting doesn't appear to be yielding the talent that we need. The coaching, especially if the pitcher like Zach Eflin's going to say to Chris Young, hey, I'm going to go back and do it my way, and then he has success. What's going on here? What do the Phillies need to do in terms of their coaching staffs and their scouting department to be competitive in the near future?
Yeah, I guess what they obviously believe that they need some new blood in there. They believe in the modern way of teaching, which is why they have this guy Jason Oshart from Driveline. He kind of teaches, hitting from an analytics point of view in terms of swing plane and developing a swing first and then kind of learning how to hit, I guess, so to speak. And they believe that this is the wave of the future, and they're kind of going all in on it. In terms of how that's going to pan out, it's probably too early, but they're definitely going hard in that direction. and which is why they pretty much, you mentioned, abandoned all of their old hitting coaches from the top down last year. And this is the modern Phillies. Now, my point of view again is you can have a balance there. Like if you believe that this works, okay, but I also think that you need to have a guy like Charlie Manuel come in just to talk about feel or talk about, getting in the batter's box and feeling confident. There's the former Phillies pitching coach, Rich Doobie. He had a lot of he just earned a ton of respect from his pitchers over the years. He worked with pitchers. He helped pitchers that were on the downsides of their career, having bad seasons, and had them bounce back. There's not really a place for him in the game anymore, which is kind of crazy. I mean, this is a guy who in 2010 in spring training went up to Roy Halladay, who just joined the team, and said, "Hey, what can I do to help you? What have you always wanted to do in your career and haven't been able to do?" And Roy told him, "It's like I've never been able to throw a changeup. It's been kind of my Achilles heel over the years." And Rich Doobie showed him a changeup grip that he thought might work for him. Roy went out there, started playing catch with it, and literally within seconds said, I think I got it. I think this is going to work." And Rich said, "Roy, let's relax, buddy. You've only played catch with this for a few minutes." He's like, "No, I think I've got it. I think this is the one." And Roy Halladay developed a changeup and ended up winning a Cy Young that year and throwing a perfect game and throwing a postseason no-hitter. And the point being, a guy like Rich Doobie has all of this experience, just like Rick Kranitz. He can not only spot somebody's flaw in a delivery, he can not only teach a guy a new pitch, but he can also use the experience of just, hey, this is what happened to Roy Halladay. This is what happened with Cole Hamels in 2009 when he struggled. I remember Brad Lidge, he was perfect in 08 and he was terrible in 09, and this is how he handled it. That experience to me is invaluable, but unfortunately I think a lot of people in the modern game would just rather kind of dismiss that and say, well, he doesn't really believe in spin rates and the modern way of pitching. So we really don't want this guy around, and I think a lot of knowledge is lost because of that.
Well, given the various issues, the coaching, the scouting, and what happened in 2019. Was this season a minor setback, or is this an organization in serious trouble?
I hate to say this, but I think next year is really going to be the year where we're going to find out, because the injury stuff was real enough that you can't really get a true assessment of what went on this year. Now, I do think you can get a clear picture of, they did screw up firing Rick Kranitz. They do make the approach to hitting and even the approach to pitching too complicated at times. I did hear a lot of hitters at the end of the season say, I'm just trying to keep things simple. And the offense did play a little bit better over the last month and a half under Charlie Manuel than they did under John Maley. But I think next season, if they can make those adjustments in terms of how they coach and hitting and pitching at the major league level, and if some of these guys get healthy, I do think they should be better. But if they go out next season and they don't apply any of the lessons learned this year, and if it wasn't just the injuries, and if they do bring Gabe Kapler back, then I think you can say this organization is not anywhere where it should be. So next year is huge. If they make the playoffs, I think that the talent on the team they have enough talent on the team to be a playoff team. But they've got to, obviously they have to go out and they have to do it.
Well, let's turn to a more pleasant subject. You've written a book on Roy Halladay, Doc, The Life of Roy Halladay, to be published by Triumph Books next spring. I know you covered Roy. How well did you get to know him?
I got to know him about as well as any reporter would get to know Roy Halladay, because he was such a preparation freak that he didn't really give his time to a lot of people, particularly reporters. And I don't say that in a bad way. He really turned his career around when he learned that preparation was critical for him. So you never saw Roy in the clubhouse before a game sitting in his locker doing nothing. He wasn't sitting in his locker on his phone. He wasn't sitting in the middle of the clubhouse BSing with his teammates. He was always doing something. So the only opportunities I ever really had to talk with Roy were post-game after he pitched, or on the rare instance where you could actually set something up days in advance to get like 10 minutes of his time for a story that you were working on. But I did get to see him up close every day for 4 seasons, 2 really good ones, obviously, and then two bad ones, unfortunately. But his story always, I always thought he had such an amazing story. You know, he was a first-round draft pick, almost threw a no-hitter in his second career big league start, and then he had a 10.64 ERA in 2000. To this day, it remains the highest ERA of any pitcher in baseball history with 50 or more innings in a season. So, you know, Roy Halladay, Hall of Fame pitcher, you can make the argument had the worst season ever in baseball history for a pitcher. He went down. They demoted him all the way down to A-ball in 2001. He totally changed his delivery. He met Harvey Dorfman, the famous sports psychologist, and the new delivery, his work with Harvey Dorfman, plus obviously his talent, catapulted him into this just upper stratosphere of just dominance for more than a decade. And so that to me is amazing, that he could kind of turn around his career. I mean, he was a couple bad months away from being released by the Blue Jays. And then the other amazing part of his story, which I wanted to tell, is after his career is over, here was a guy that made hundreds of millions of dollars in his career. He could have just sat at home and fished and golfed and just kind of relaxed, and he wanted to help young players like Harvey helped him, and so he got a job with the Phillies as a mental skills coach on the minor league side, and he went there a few days a week, had office hours, and tried to help these young pitchers kind of exercise the demons that he had in his life, you know, because he knew that there were other people out there. He knew that he wasn't the only one that was struggling on mentally, and he really wanted to help these people. So, you know, I thought that was just amazing that this guy, again, Hall of Fame talent, rich beyond his wildest dreams, still wanted to come to work every day and try to help people out. So that was kind of the goal of the book, was to try to tell those two stories and kind of like, you know, how his legacy lives on, even though he passed away a couple of years ago.
And that's truly the tragedy of his life story. He had so much more to offer to younger players, and, you know, that went unrealized. Sports Illustrated ran an online story not too long ago that interviewed pretty extensively family, particularly his father, and it was revealed that he was taking painkillers. I'm not going to say abusing them, but taking them rather heavily, and that's probably what led to his untimely death. How do you handle that part of the story?
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. You know, I've talked with Roy's wife, Brandy, and she's tried to help me put some of that stuff into perspective. And, you know, Roy struggled. You know, he struggled. He always felt pressure to be the best, and he always wanted to please people. And he, at the end of his career, you know, he had a very serious back injury. You know, he had pars fractures in his back and a rotodisc in his back, and, you know, basically could not function not only as a pitcher, but just as a regular average Joe human being because of this back pain. So he ended up taking pain medication because he wanted to continue to pitch. He felt he owed it to the Phillies, to the fans. He felt he owed it to his teammates to try to get through that contract, the last 2 years of his contract, and he just was not able to do it. So he ended up taking these pain meds, and as it happens to a lot of people, other athletes, people that are in car accidents, whatever, you become dependent on it, and he kind of became dependent on these pain medications, and he tried hard to get off of it, and he was working in that toward that goal, and then unfortunately, tragically, he passed away in that plane crash, and everybody kind of wonders what if, what would have happened, what happened that day, what would have happened in the rest of his life, would he have become the next Harvey Dorfman, what would he have been, what would he have been doing? And unfortunately, we'll never totally know, although I do suspect that he would have been, knowing Roy, he would have been the next Harvey Dorfman, or I think he would have been an excellent pitching coach one day. Believe it or not, I think Roy, he was a big video guy. He was a big numbers guy. In a way, I think Roy would have been the ultimate pitching coach in today's day and age. I think he would have really gotten something out of, the spin rates that they were teaching and the and the scouting with the analytics. But I also think his mental approach to the game as well as his physical approach to the game, he would have been every bit as good of a pitching coach as he was a pitcher in the big leagues.
Mm-hmm. Truly a very, very tragic loss. We've been speaking with Todd Zolecki, Phillies beat writer for MLB.com and author of the forthcoming doc, The Life of Roy Halladay, to be published by Triumph Books next spring. I know you'll be able to pick it up at a local Barnes & Noble's bookstore and, of course, online at Amazon.com. I think Amazon is even actually taking pre-orders right now, so that's good news. Todd, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Anytime. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia baseball, past, present, and personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.